It's the semi-finals of the Weissenhaus Freestyle Chess 2024. We have Magnus Carlsen taking on Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Nodirbek in this tournament has been absolutely flawless, and he won the rapid playoffs. And now playing against Magnus Carlsen, this is going to be a big
You are ready
challenge
for the first
for the
match of
world
the
number one.
semi-final. Good luck to all of
Carlsen,
you.
on his
Please
own,
start the games.
had a tough game against Alireza Firuza, a tough match, but he came back in the rapids and managed to take it through. If you look at the position for today, the king and queen have been reversed, and the knights and the bishop as well. So you can see Magnus taking his time for the first move. Also, Magnus did not discuss this position in the 10 minutes before the game with anyone. He was just thinking on his own and trying to figure out what he should be doing. Meanwhile, Nodirbek Abdusattorov discussed with Kaimer, Caruana, and has quite some idea about this position. What are the possibilities here? Well, one is to open this pawn, the other is to open the central pawns. That is the first idea. The other plan could be to move your c pawn, opening up the bishop, or the f pawn, opening up this bishop. But Magnus, he adjusts his pieces. He wanted to make a move, and now he just gets all of them ready. He's thinking very hard what his first move ought to be. In many of the games of this round, the first move that was played was e4 because the queen supports it and it feels like the right move to play. But Magnus also is taking into consideration that his opponent was discussing with others, and while he did not, so he would like to take him out of theory, whichever that theory is, for 2 minutes, which they have discussed, or for 10 minutes. And now Magnus seems to be ready with his move, and he plays his pawn to g4. Very interesting move, doesn't control the center. And with g4, what he's essentially trying to do is maybe get his knight out to g3 and maybe then f4, and he's just playing a fresh position here. This is one of the beauties of freestyle chess or chess diet 60, that there is absolutely no theory, and so the players can come to the board and start thinking. Here they have 90 minutes to make 40 moves without any increment. So that is quite a lot of time, but also at some point it starts to run low, because you have to be thinking about so many different possibilities. And so now Nodirbek gets into action. He's thinking about what his answer ought to be. He plays his pawn up to e5, which is a very logical move. He's controlling the center here, and he's stopping white from playing d4, f4, all these moves. Well, maybe f4 is actually a possibility here, but the thing is, after rook takes, the knight jumps in and attacks the rook, and this is exactly what Magnus may not want to do. So he has to now think about his next move. Magnus Carlsen comes back to the board, and you will see on the clock that Magnus has 1 hour 27 minutes while Nodirbek has 1 hour 26 minutes. Just one move has been played, which just goes to show how difficult this format is. Knight comes to g3. With this knight threatening to come here to f5 and attack this pawn, Nodirbek has to remain careful. He plays his pawn to f6. Now look at the harmony here. You could stop the knight from coming to f5 with the move g6, but then your bishop on g8 is blocked, so is your knight on h8. You have to think about all of your pieces. So f6 kind of helps all the pieces. If you put your knight here, now the queen can come out and defend. So d4 played here by Magnus, and very interesting move, because Magnus is essentially giving up a pawn. If you were to take here, I believe what Magnus wants to do is play f4, attacking this pawn, and then after c5 he will go c3, and this is quite a creative way to play. Nodirbek is not interested in the pawn. He goes knight b6, And once again, what he wants to do here is come to c4 and attack the b2 pawn. Now Magnus can take the pawn on e5. That seems like a normal move, but he goes knight d3. He develops. Once again, the position is getting more sharp and sharp. If you take here, Magnus can play f3 or f4, attacking this pawn here. And then now c5 is no longer possible because the knight controls that square. Nodirbek has to think about his next move. Move like e4 would be a mistake because knight jumps in, attacking b7 and e4. He plays d6 and he solidifies his center. The only problem with Nodirbek's strategy here is his bishop on b8. One of the things that he can do with that bishop is to play a6 and bishop a7. And with that, he could activate that bishop, or c6 and bishop c7 also could be possible. But now Magnus thinking about what his next move can be here. Also, one must look at Magnus. The amount of water he consumes during the game is quite a bit, and that's one of the things that chess players should always take care of, because they sit for long hours and it's important to have good consumption of water. Now f3 opens up the bishop. It also stops e4 in many cases, and so it's a useful move to play. You will already see that the game has no real contours as compared to a normal game of chess, the standard chess. The moves are completely weirdly happening. And now bishop takes d4 seems like a natural way to continue the position. Just take the pawn on the d4 square. Magnus is taking his time here. But what else? You could think about knight f5, attacking g7 and d4. But then maybe g6, knight takes d4, and then c5. Suddenly the black pawns are moving forward. So Magnus simply takes the bishop, takes the pawn with his bishop. And now the black pawn can push forward to c5. Yes, that's exactly what Nodirbek does, and he kills two birds with the same stone. Firstly, he moves the c pawn so that he attacks the bishop. Magnus brings his bishop back to f2. The second thing which he's doing is he's making a square for his own bishop, which is quite an important thing here. So bishop from b8 can come back to c7. And once you do that, just imagine. But Nodirbek is not interested in slow play. He goes c4. He's playing this position very actively. And he's telling Magnus that, what are you going to do about this knight? Are you going to go back? Are you coming to f4? Because f4 also doesn't seem like a very stable square. It will get hit by d5. And the bishop would attack the knight. So one of the things that Magnus can do here is to chop off this knight on b6, double the pawns, and then put his knight on b4 where it cannot be disturbed, and it becomes an outpost here. So that is slightly awkward, but it looks logical in a way that you are putting your knight on a square from where it cannot be kicked off. So Magnus takes, pawn takes, and now the knight can go to b4, which seems like the best square because there the knight is well positioned. Let's see who has managed to come out of the opening in good light after Magnus's next move, knight b4. I think that seems like a logical move to play. He plays it. White has a good knight on b4 looking at the d5 square, another good knight at g3 looking at the f5 square. But black has center control with d5 and c4. His bishop is beautiful on this long diagonal. The other bishop looks slightly weird, but Magnus can actually activate his own bishop with c3 here, and that's exactly what he does. He moves his pawn ahead to c3 and now opens up his bishop. So in terms of coordination, I actually like Magnus's position because all his pieces are doing a good job. But if you look at Nodirbek, he is sort of angling in on the dark squared weaknesses. Suddenly the queen can't come up to d2. If it goes to f2, suddenly the bishop sits here, very strong and powerful piece. So does Nodirbek have an advantage here? Magnus says not really. This is a double attack now, and it has to be carefully navigated. It was also possible to play your knight to f5, attacking this pawn, and after g6 to try for something very tactical with e3. It was in the air to play this way, but turns out that Magnus prefers going with his knight to the other side of the board, and I think Nodirbek has to defend his bishop and also the pawn on g7. So bishop h6 seems like the natural move to play. Taking his time here, Nodirbek, for what is to be done, and I think now he goes back, bishop h6. How should Magnus continue here? He plays his pawn to f4. Very interesting. I think what he wants is, he wants his queen to come up to d2, attack this weakness on d5, and which is why he wanted to block this bishop. Nodirbek goes long castle, and with one move he suddenly got his king to safety, relatively safe position, and defended his d5 pawn. Also, moves like d4 need to be taken care of now, with the king right in the center of the board. This is actually going to get quite tricky here for white. Maybe you want to play your pawn to e3 here, just to control this square. But Magnus goes knight to g3. Maybe he wants to put his knight here. One move that comes to my mind straight off is d4. Pushing so that the king is here. But the point is, after check, king b8, you can long castle here, and that seems to be playable. So what happened here? He played g6, stopping the knight from coming to f5, and Magnus pushed his pawn to e3, defending this central structure. Queen comes into d7, attacking the g4 pawn. Now this pawn needs to be defended, and I think the best way to do it is pushing the pawn to h3. He goes queen e2. He goes queen up to e2, defending here. Nodirbek now starts to speed up. He goes rook e8. His idea is to put pressure on c2. Magnus plays knight to c2. E3 pawn is defended. Bishop comes to f8, wanting to come here and attack this. Now the game is heating up. The pieces are maneuvering beautifully here for both sides. Who's going to come out on top? Because Magnus does have the d4 square at his disposal. But black has his pieces so beautifully positioned in the center of the board. Also, the bishop could come to c5 and then start putting pressure here. It's interesting now to note what is the move that Magnus Carlsen should play. One is, of course, to play his knight to the d4 square, which is a good square for the knight. The other one is to maybe push the pawn to b4. And this is a very creative move because it stops bishop from coming here. And if you take, I can take back, opening up my rook. So that seems like a good plan. The other idea, of course, is to maybe just short castle here, which is also possible. You just play this way. The king is moved to safety. Magnus once again drinking lots of water there. Comes in. Both players were absent from the board. He writes down the move. I really like castling in this chess 960 because the king, which is suddenly here, which is under some pressure, goes to g1 out of the blue. Okay, bishop comes to e6. Nodirbek getting serious here. He wants to attack this pawn on g4. Magnus plays h3. h5 played. Now this is not a good idea because here it seems like white can push the pawn to f5. This seems like a normal move, f5, but Nodirbek might just drop back his bishop to f7. What is Magnus going to do? Is he going to push the pawn to f5? He goes knight d4, and after h takes g4, I think Nodirbek just simply played it too quick. What he had to do is push his pawn to h4, hitting the knight, and let's say the knight goes back to h1, it won't be that great. Maybe f5 is the move. And then go back here to g8, which is the plan. Like if you played bishop f7 here, then after fg6, bishop g6, the knight sits here, which is a good square for the knight. But he went pawn takes, and Magnus pushed his pawn up to f5. Very classy move, because if you take here, now all of a sudden knight takes, queen takes or rook takes, and bishop f5, and white is winning here. So he had to go bishop f7, pawn takes pawn happened. It seems like white is slowly taking control of the position. Maybe Nodirbek had something on his mind, but on the other hand, it seems like suddenly Magnus's pieces are just so beautifully positioned. Well, that's also one thing about chess 960 is that when your position starts to deteriorate, you don't even understand that it's happening as clearly as a normal game, a standard game of chess. So queen c7 played by Nodirbek. He is looking at the knight. The knight is attacked, and one way to deal with this is to take on g6 and put the knight on f5, but he prefers to keep control, and which is the right decision. Because this pawn on f5 is greatly limiting this knight on h8 from coming out into the game. Bishop h6 played. He's attacking the pawn on e3. Rook e1 played here just to control this e3 square, and Nodirbek plays his bishop to g5. I was wondering if you could put more pressure on this e3 pawn, and how would Magnus deal with it. Maybe he would put his king up, but that could have been a better idea. He plays bishop g5. Magnus pushes his pawn to a4, and Nodirbek now takes the pawn on f5. With this move a4, Magnus has signaled that he wants to start an attack on the queen side with a5. Pawn takes. One would imagine that taking back with the pawn to be the right decision to limit here, but bishop h4 somehow is a very powerful move. And so he goes bishop takes, king b8, and now plays rook e2. Well, he could have just continued a5 or in the position, but maybe Magnus was more keen on the fact that he can put his rook on a2 here. And rook e2 also comes out of this pin. Knight comes in for Nodirbek now. The knight, if it comes to the e5 square, it would be an absolute monster looking at the d3 square. And so Magnus simply chops it off. Bishop takes. And now the knight can jump in here to f5. That's exactly what Magnus does. He puts his knight. Look at both of his knights. Very nicely placed in the center. But Nodirbek saying, my bishop's not to be messed with. a5. The game speeds up like anything. Both players have around 16 minutes on the clock, and they need to make another 11 moves to reach move 40. a5 played, and I think Nodirbek must take here. Rook takes does look a bit scary with the other rook coming in, but it should be fine after queen e4. But instead Nodirbek seems to have blundered. He plays his queen to e4. He wants to trade queens, which is fine, but after queen takes queen, rook takes queen. Let's see. By the way, he could take with the pawn, but the rook makes more sense because he wants to take here. ab6. Isn't white completely better here? Well, the point is Nodirbek wants to take here, of course. And what's happening? It's also chaotic. Because if you move your king up to d2, then suddenly there is bishop takes, knight takes, and black is okay. But Magnus fights this excellent move threatening mate in 1. Goes check. And now king can come up to e2. Well, all of a sudden the game has become very sharp and it seems like Magnus has come on top. Okay, if you give another check, I'm going to simply come up. So he takes the rook. Now there's no mate. If black can somehow win this pawn, he should be completely fine. But that is a big if in the position. And Magnus seems to be totally better. He goes rook e8. He is attacking the pawn on e3. But also he wants to come to... He can't come to e6 because the knight controls it. He somehow wants to win this pawn. But how? Maybe rook e5 is on his mind. Here the best move is rook h1. Magnus finds it. It was the only move. And also the thing is, let's imagine that you played something else like b5. Then now I take and play rook e6 and win this pawn. But with rook h1, what has happened is that now if you play here bishop f5, knight f5, rook e6, it's a back rank mate. So Nodirbek goes rook f8. But now the knight comes to d6 and all of a sudden what is happening here is knight coming in here, check, and it's a mate on the a file. It's like black king is completely toasted. Bishops can't do a thing and Nodirbek resigns the game. That ended so abruptly from a position that was complicated. Within few moves under time pressure, Nodirbek Abdusattorov has simply lost the game. That just goes to show what complex position Magnus had created on the board. He now gets a 1-0 lead in the match, which is an important lead. Nodirbek tomorrow has to strike with the white pieces, and they are discussing a bit that Magnus says you should have taken on a5 first without giving ab6 as an option. Rook a5 could have been played, and then Nodirbek wasn't happy with it, but I guess that was the lesser evil there.